It was a usual morning in the heart of downtown Chicago, with the crisp city air buzzing with the hurried pace of life. The sound of car horns, the chatter of commuters, and the distant clink of construction work filled the streets. Among this urban symphony, one moment would change everything for a little homeless girl, a man who had touched the lives of millions, and the kind of decision that would make the world pause. Michael Jordan had just finished a meeting with his management team, eager to get back to his quiet home. His iconic presence, still towering over the crowds, was unmistakable. An athlete turned philanthropist, a hero to many. As he stepped out of a luxury building, his trademark basketball shoes echoed on the pavement, the sunlight casting a long shadow behind him. His bodyguard, a calm and attentive man named Frank, stood waiting by the sleek black limousine that was ready to take him to the next event. But this wasn't just another day on his calendar. This day would be different. Michael's encounter with the homeless girl. It was an ordinary morning, the kind where the city of Chicago seemed to pulse with life. Car horns honking, pedestrians rushing past, and the hum of construction vibrating from the far corners of the city. Michael Jordan, a legend of the basketball court, stood at the curb outside a luxury hotel, preparing to climb into his waiting limousine. Despite his fame, the world around him felt distant, as if separated by a glass wall. Here he was, surrounded by wealth, accolades, and admiration, but in this moment, everything would change. A small figure darted past him, moving too fast for Michael to react. Before he could fully comprehend what had just happened, he felt the soft tug on his leg. Looking down, he saw a little girl, fragile, vulnerable, completely bald, with eyes filled with fear, clinging to him as if he were her lifeline. Her small hands gripped his leg, trembling with a terror that ran deeper than the streets around them. For a heartbeat, Michael stood frozen. The disparity between his world and hers was striking. He had spent his life on courts, surrounded by fame, wealth, and the cheering of crowds. Yet here in this moment he found himself face to face with a deep human need that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't looking up at him, avoiding his gaze as though her pain was too immense to be shared with a stranger. Instead, she stared out at something far beyond, something that haunted her, perhaps a place or a memory too dark to revisit. Michael gently placed a hand on her trembling shoulder. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Hey there, are you okay?" he asked. But before she could respond, a voice broke through, bitter, angry. A store owner, red-faced and seething with frustration, began to rant about the girl. "She's nothing but trouble," he spat. "She's always around my store, scaring off customers. I can't stand it." Michael's expression remained calm, though his mind began to race. The man's words were harsh and filled with judgment, but there was something about them that didn't sit right. Michael's heart sank as he realized this wasn't just about a little girl. This was about a broken system that saw her as a problem, not as a person. "Has she actually done anything wrong?" he asked gently, not out of defensiveness, but out of genuine curiosity. "Has she stolen something?" The store owner hesitated, then muttered reluctantly, "No, but she's always there, always touching everything. It's unsettling." Michael's gaze softened, a quiet understanding passing through him. "Maybe there's more to her story than we can see," he said, his voice filled with an underlying wisdom. He didn't know her story yet, but he could see enough to understand that this little girl was more than just a nuisance. She was a human being in need of care, and Michael knew he couldn't walk away without doing something. As the limousine door swung open, Michael turned to step inside, his mind still on the fragile figure he'd just met. For the first time that day, the city didn't feel so far away. Michael takes action. As Michael settled into the back of the limousine, the world outside seemed to blur. The streets of Chicago, teeming with life, no longer felt as vibrant or bustling. His thoughts were consumed by the small girl he had just met. The way she clung to him, as though his very presence could provide the safety she so desperately needed. The sudden, unexpected encounter had stirred something deep within him. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. There was a raw, unspoken connection that he couldn't shake off. Michael had lived his life in the public eye, understanding fame, pressure, and what it felt like to be seen by millions. Yet in this moment, he felt a kind of helplessness he hadn't encountered before. This was different. He had been a hero on the court, leading his team to victory with unparalleled skill. But off the court, he wasn't sure how to be the kind of hero she needed. He turned to Frank, his loyal chauffeur, his voice heavy with determination. "Drive slowly, Frank. I want to keep an eye out for her." The words carried a weight that went beyond the typical instructions for a city drive. There was urgency in Michael's voice, a quiet plea for action. Frank, sensing the gravity in Michael's tone, nodded in understanding, adjusting the car's pace. They drifted through the city streets, weaving through traffic, while Michael's gaze scanned every corner, every alley. He wasn't just looking for a girl, he was searching for a story that he knew had to be heard. The girl's frightened eyes, her hesitant touch, and the overwhelming sadness that clung to her like a shadow, all of it seemed to call out to him. The car passed by the usual crowd of morning commuters, tourists milling around, vendors preparing their carts, but none of these faces mattered. Michael's eyes flicked from person to person, searching for that small, frail figure among the crowd. He felt a connection to her that was more profound than anything he had experienced in years. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a child in need. As the car turned a corner, Michael's heart skipped. There she was. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted her sitting alone on the sidewalk outside a convenience store. Her paper cup, once empty, now rested beside her, a sad reminder of the little she had. Michael's heart ached. She hadn't disappeared into the streets, lost to the noise and confusion of the world. She was still there. "Frank," Michael said urgently, "pull over here." The car came to a smooth stop and Michael stepped out, every step bringing him closer to a moment that would change both their lives forever. As he walked toward her, the noise of the city faded, leaving only the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat and the sound of his breath. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up at him, recognition flashing in her eyes. The fragile innocence in her gaze stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. "Hello again," he said gently, crouching down to her level, hoping to meet her in the same space of vulnerability she had shown him. Her eyes widened in surprise, and without a word she reached out, grabbing his leg once more, but this time there was no fear in her grip. Only a desperate hope. Michael smiled softly, taking a moment to steady his emotions before speaking again. "Here, let me help." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a few bills, placing them gently into the cup she held out for donations. As she glanced at the money, her face lit up with surprise, her shock transforming into a mix of gratitude and awe. And for a moment, Michael Jordan wasn't the man who'd changed the world with his basketball skills. He was simply a person, reaching out to help a child in need. Michael finds the girl again. As the limousine hummed along the streets, Michael couldn't shake the weight of what he had just witnessed. The girl's wide eyes, filled with both fear and an unspoken plea for help, haunted him. It was as if her entire world was filled with uncertainty, with people who judged her without understanding, and a life that had been shaped by hardship. He had offered her money, but deep down Michael knew that wasn't enough. She needed more than financial aid. She needed something far more valuable: compassion, hope, and a chance at a better future. "Frank," Michael said, his voice calm but firm, "drive slower. I want to keep looking for her." There was an urgency in his tone that Frank couldn't ignore. Michael's mind was no longer on the photo shoot or the meeting that awaited him. It was on the fragile girl who had briefly crossed his path, someone who had been invisible to most of the world but had for some reason been seen by him. And now he couldn't walk away. The city unfolded before them, the usual sights of bustling sidewalks and busy intersections filling the air, but for Michael the noise and motion felt distant. His eyes darted over every person, every corner, every alley, searching for that small, bald figure he had briefly encountered. It wasn't just about finding her again, it was about making sure that she wasn't left behind in the rush of the world. Michael's thoughts drifted back to her fragile embrace as she had clung to his leg in that brief but poignant moment. The desperation in her actions had stirred something in him, something deeper than just sympathy. It was a call to action. He had seen countless faces over the years, but there was something about her, something about how she had reached out to him, that felt like a sign that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up. And then, as if fate had answered his unspoken prayer, Michael's eyes landed on her again. She was sitting on the cold, hard sidewalk outside a convenience store, her small paper cup extended before her in a silent plea for help. Her shoulders were slumped in exhaustion, her head tilted down as she watched the passing feet of strangers who paid no attention to her. Without a second thought, Michael gave Frank a subtle nod. "Pull over," he instructed. The limousine slowed to a stop, and without hesitation, Michael opened the door, stepping out onto the pavement. He could feel his heart pounding, the weight of the moment pressing on him as he made his way toward her. As he approached, the girl looked up, her face lit up with recognition, and for a brief moment Michael saw the flicker of hope in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to return, but there he was, standing before her, offering not just money, but the promise of something more, something that went beyond the material. Michael crouched down beside her, his voice soft but filled with determination. "Hey, it's me again," he said gently, hoping his presence would provide a sense of comfort, of safety. He reached into his wallet once more, pulling out a few large bills, and placed them into her cup. The girl's eyes widened with surprise, and without warning she leapt into his arms, wrapping her small arms around his leg in a gesture of gratitude and wonder. This time there was no fear in her touch, just a deep, unspoken thanks. "Thank you," she whispered against his pants, her voice muffled but filled with emotion. Her grip tightened, as though she was afraid that if she let go he would disappear. And then, as she pulled away, her face looked up at him with the innocence of a child who had witnessed more than her fair share of pain. "Are you Michael Jordan?" she asked, her voice full of awe. Michael couldn't help but chuckle, his heart warming at the question. "Yes, I am," he said with a gentle smile, his deep voice carrying an unexpected softness. "But right now, I'm just here to help." He paused, glancing around at the busy street. "What's your name?" "Sonia," she whispered. The sadness in her eyes returned briefly and her voice faltered. "Please help me," she said, almost too quietly to hear. "I need something important." Michael's heart tightened as he looked down at the girl. This wasn't just about offering charity. It wasn't about being a hero in the eyes of the world. It was about giving this little girl, this innocent soul, a chance to be seen, to be heard, to be helped in ways that went beyond anything money could buy. In that moment, Michael knew his actions were only just beginning. This was no longer just a brief encounter, it was a turning point. He couldn't walk away, not now, not after seeing the need in her eyes. The girl's silent plea. As the limousine glided through the streets, Michael's mind was heavy with thoughts of Sonia, the little girl he had just encountered. Her trembling form, her hopeful eyes, the quiet desperation in her voice. It all weighed on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The money he'd given her was a temporary fix, but he knew it was far from enough. There was something deeper at play here, something that transcended the material world he knew so well. Michael had lived a life of privilege, a life that most could only dream of. But in that moment, sitting in the back of the limousine, the weight of his success felt hollow. The glimmer of fame and fortune didn't mean much in the face of the raw reality of the world outside. The world where children like Sonia were left to fend for themselves, without any help or compassion. His heart ached as he thought about her. What had she gone through to get to this point? How had she ended up alone on the cold streets of Chicago, with nothing but the small cup she held to catch the attention of passing strangers? As the limousine weaved through the traffic, Michael's gaze was fixed on the passing crowd, hoping to spot Sonia once more. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that her plea had touched him on a level he couldn't ignore. It was as if the world had given him this moment, this chance to make a difference, and he couldn't turn away. He turned to Frank, his voice steady but carrying a note of urgency. "Drive slower. I want to make sure she's okay." His words weren't just a request, they were a commitment. This wasn't just about finding her again, it was about making sure she didn't slip through the cracks of a world that had already failed her. The streets, once filled with the usual hum of city life, now seemed distant and irrelevant. Michael wasn't looking for anything or anyone else but her. He needed to know her story, to understand why she was in so much pain. The thought of her alone, vulnerable and uncertain about her future, filled him with a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. Then, like a sign from above, Michael saw her again. She was sitting outside a small convenience store, her paper cup still in front of her, empty. Her posture was slumped, worn out by the harshness of life on the streets. She didn't look up as he approached, as if she had already learned the hard truth that no one ever stops for someone like her. No one ever really sees her. But Michael did. He didn't just see a homeless girl. He saw a person. He saw a child who had been stripped of her innocence by the world around her. A child who had never been given the chance to hope, to dream, to live without fear. And in that moment, Michael knew he couldn't walk away again. "Frank, pull over," Michael instructed, his voice resolute. The limousine slowed and Michael stepped out into the street, his footsteps steady but filled with a quiet resolve. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He knew it wasn't just about money. It was about offering her a glimpse of a future beyond the streets. It was about showing her that there was someone who truly cared. As he walked towards her, he could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about a little girl who had been forgotten by society, whose voice had been drowned out by the noise of the world. He crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze for the first time. Her eyes were still filled with uncertainty, but there was something else, too. Something that flickered in the depths of her soul. It was hope. "Hey, it's me again," Michael said softly, his voice filled with warmth. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a few more bills, placing them gently into her cup. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time that day she looked up at him with a sense of wonder. But this time it wasn't just about the money. It was about a promise. Michael wasn't going to let her slip through the cracks. He wasn't going to walk away. Sonia's health crisis. As Michael sat beside Sonia in the back of the limousine, the weight of her silent plea lingered in the air between them. Her fragile form, curled slightly in the seat, seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken stories. She had spoken so little, yet revealed so much. The desperate look in her eyes, the tremble in her voice. It wasn't just fear of being abandoned again. It was something deeper, something more painful. Michael had seen his share of adversity in his life, years of pressure, competition, and struggle. But this was different. He had fought for championships, for greatness, but now he found himself fighting for something far more profound. A child's future, her well-being. He felt a responsibility, not because of his fame or wealth, but because he understood what it meant to have someone show up when it mattered most. Sonia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the stillness of the limousine offering little comfort against the exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down. Her small, fragile frame seemed even more out of place in the luxury of the car, as if the contrast between her reality and his own could not have been starker. But Michael wasn't concerned with the contrast. He was concerned with her. "What do you need, Sonia?" he asked softly, his voice steady but filled with concern. She hesitated, her small hand trembling as she reached up to touch her bald head. Then, without speaking, she lifted her sleeve, revealing a dark, bruised mark on her arm. Michael's heart clenched as he looked at the mark. It was like a silent scream, one that she had been too scared to vocalize. His eyes softened, a sense of understanding dawning on him. "Are you sick?" he asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart raced as he processed what he was seeing. The signs were unmistakable. Sonia wasn't just homeless, she was ill. Sonia nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "The orphanage, they said I need special medicine, but they don't have enough money," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I've been trying to save, but it's not enough. I don't know how long I can wait." Her words trailed off, swallowed by the weight of her truth. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a child without a home. This was about a child fighting for her life, caught in a system that had failed her. She was sick, and she had no way of getting the care she needed. For the first time in his life, Michael felt the sharp edge of helplessness. He wasn't sure how to fix everything for her. He wasn't sure if he even had the power to. But in that moment, he understood that doing nothing wasn't an option. He turned to Frank, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. "Find that orphanage. Get us there, now." As the car sped towards the orphanage, Michael couldn't shake the image of Sonia's tired eyes, her frail body, and the mark on her arm. He was determined to make sure she got the help she so desperately needed, but in the back of his mind, he knew that even if he could help her now, the world still had much more to do to heal the wounds that children like Sonia carried every day. As the limousine moved toward its destination, Michael's resolve grew stronger. He wouldn't just be a witness to her suffering, he would act. He would be the one to help her, and he wasn't going to stop until she got the care she deserved. The journey had only just begun. A promise made. The sound of the tires humming along the smooth pavement was the only noise that filled the space inside the limousine as Michael sat with Sonia, his mind churning with thoughts of what to do next. The weight of the situation felt like an anchor around his chest. Sonia was more than just a girl in need. She was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in a world that too often overlooked the most vulnerable. The sight of her dark bruise and the way her small body trembled against the plush interior of the limousine gnawed at Michael's heart. The disease, the suffering, the uncertainty. It wasn't fair. No child should ever have to live like this, and certainly not a child who deserved the opportunity to live a full life. He thought about how in her silence she had conveyed more truth than most people did with 1,000 words. Her life wasn't just about her fight for survival on the streets. It was about a battle for something much bigger: hope, dignity, and a future. Sonia, though clearly exhausted, had a quiet strength about her that Michael couldn't ignore. She didn't beg, she didn't cry, she simply looked at him, the flicker of hope in her eyes barely visible beneath the veil of fear and pain. She wasn't asking for a handout, she was asking for someone to see her, really see her. And that's exactly what Michael was going to do. As the limousine finally pulled up in front of the orphanage, Michael could see the nervousness settle back into Sonia's body. She shrank slightly, her shoulders slumped with the weight of uncertainty. Despite the warmth and safety of the car, Sonia's body language spoke volumes of the scars she carried, both seen and unseen. "Hey, it's going to be okay," Michael reassured her, gently, his voice soft but steady. "We're here now, and I'm not going anywhere until we make sure you get the help you need." Sonia gave a small, hesitant nod, but Michael could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. It was a look that cut deeper than any words. She had been let down before, and who could blame her for doubting that anyone would be there to help now? Her life had been one disappointment after another, and the world had shown her very few reasons to believe in kindness. As they made their way toward the entrance of the orphanage, Michael noticed the hesitation in Sonia's steps. She was slowing down, almost unwilling to move forward. Her gaze shifted between the building and Michael, her feet planted firmly on the ground, as if the weight of the moment was too much for her to bear. Without thinking, Michael extended his hand, offering her the comfort and support she needed. "Come on, Sonia," he said softly. "You don't have to be afraid. I've got you." And as they reached the bottom of the stairs, something unexpected happened. Sonia's legs buckled beneath her, and she tumbled, collapsing to the ground. The sight of her small body crumpling was a jolt to Michael, a painful reminder of just how fragile she was, how much she had endured to survive. His heart raced as he rushed to her side, instinctively reaching out to catch her before she hit the pavement. He gently cradled her head in his hands, relieved to see that she was still conscious, though clearly in pain. But the cut on her forehead, the bruises, the fragile state of her body, it all told a story of neglect and hardship far greater than Michael could comprehend. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, dialing emergency services. As he spoke with the operator, his free hand stayed protectively on Sonia's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could in that moment of crisis. But as much as he wanted to fix everything, he knew that healing wouldn't come from a single phone call or even from his presence alone. It would take time, resources, and a network of people who cared as much as he did, but right now all he could offer was his unwavering commitment to make sure Sonia didn't fall through the cracks again. "I'm not going to leave you," Michael whispered under his breath, more to himself than to her. "We're going to fix this together." And in that moment, a quiet promise was made, a promise that, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, Michael would be there every step of the way. No child should have to face the world alone, not on his watch. A new beginning. As the ambulance lights flashed in the distance, Michael remained kneeling beside Sonia, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, offering the comfort he could while they waited for help to arrive. The intensity of the moment, the weight of responsibility that had settled over him, felt like an unexpected turning point in his life. He had lived a life full of accolades, victories, and fame, but none of that had ever carried the kind of significance this moment did. This wasn't about the accolades, the victories, or the status that came with being Michael Jordan. This was about being human. This was about doing what was right. Sonia's fragile body trembled beneath his touch, but he could feel a quiet sense of trust forming between them. Though her body was battered, there was something in her eyes that had changed. Her initial hesitation and fear had softened, replaced by a fragile hope. She had already seen so many people walk away, so many who had passed her by without a second thought. But Michael wasn't going to be one of them. As the ambulance pulled up and the paramedics rushed toward them, Michael stood to his feet, his thoughts focused solely on Sonia's well-being. The paramedics took charge, carefully tending to her injuries, checking her for signs of deeper distress. Michael stood back, watching as they worked, feeling a sense of relief that she was finally in the hands of people who could help her. As the paramedics prepared to transport Sonia to the hospital, Michael turned to Frank, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. "We're going to make sure she's okay. I'll be there every step of the way." His words were firm, a promise made not just to Sonia but to himself. He wasn't going away from this. He wasn't going to leave a child to suffer alone, not when he could do something about it. Once Sonia was safely in the ambulance, Michael climbed into the limousine, his thoughts still racing. His phone rang, an event organizer confirming details for an upcoming charity event. Michael's mind wasn't fully on the conversation. His heart and mind were still with Sonia, still focused on the promise he had made to her. "Yes, I'll be there," he replied absent-mindedly, his voice calm but his mind still 1,000 miles away. As he hung up, he turned to Frank, his voice filled with determination. "Take me to the hospital. I'm not leaving until I know she's okay." As the car sped toward the hospital, Michael's thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't shake the image of Sonia's eyes, how they had lit up when he had reached out to her, how they had softened just a little bit when she realized that someone cared. It wasn't just the physical wounds that had needed tending to, it was her spirit, her soul, that had been bruised beyond belief. And it was that, more than anything, that he was committed to healing. When they arrived at the hospital, Michael wasted no time. He headed straight for the emergency room where Sonia was being attended to. The nurses and doctors were kind, reassuring her with gentle words as they worked to stabilize her. Michael stood by, quietly watching as they took care of her, grateful for the help of professionals who could do what he could not. And as he watched her, the thoughts that had been racing in his mind finally began to slow. This moment wasn't just about helping one girl. This was a reflection of everything he stood for, giving people hope, lifting them up when they're at their lowest, and using his platform to make a real difference. "I'll be here," Michael whispered to Sonia, more to himself than to anyone else. "I promise you won't be alone." And with that promise, a new chapter in both their lives began. A chapter that was defined not by the struggle they had endured, but by the strength they would find in each other. This wasn't the end of Sonia's journey, it was just the beginning. And Michael Jordan was determined to make sure she had everything she needed to face whatever came next. If you were moved by Sonia's story and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Your support makes all the difference.